I want to start by telling you who I am and why this story matters. My name is Margaret Thompson, and I'm 67 years old. For years, I worked quietly at the Millfield Public Library, stacking books, helping people find the right stories, and keeping myself busy after my husband passed away. Life was simple, calm, and safe, until the day everything changed. 3 days ago, I lost my job. Just like that. 8 years of routine, 8 years of small but steady work, disappeared in 15 minutes as they handed me a box and pointed me to the door. My apartment felt smaller that night, the silence heavier. I remember gripping the cardboard box on the drive home, thinking about bills, groceries, and the way my life had narrowed down to survival. And then came the visit from my son, David. I had hoped for a word of comfort, maybe a little support, but instead, he arrived like a businessman on a mission. He had legal papers and a calm, measured tone, explaining how our finances would be separated. I realized in that moment that he saw me not as his mother, but as a liability. He wanted protection, insurance against my inevitable failure. I signed the papers, my hands steady even as my heart sank. As I folded the documents and watched him leave, I felt an odd calm. I knew something was coming, something neither of us could see yet. There was a letter in my kitchen drawer, waiting from Switzerland. I hadn't opened it. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat at my little table, and wondered if life could really shift so dramatically overnight. Have you ever felt invisible to the people you love the most? That's exactly how I felt as I stared out my window that evening, uncertain if I would ever be seen again. Little did I know, life had plans far bigger than a single bad day or a single legal signature. I still remember the weight of that day as if it had happened yesterday. Walking out of the library with a cardboard box under my arm, I felt exposed in a way I hadn't in years. The job had been more than work, it had been routine, purpose, a little thread holding my life together after my husband passed. And suddenly, it was gone. I kept telling myself that I would figure something out, but inside, a quiet panic had begun to rise. When David came to check on me, I thought maybe he would offer comfort. Maybe he would acknowledge my loss, my fear, my loneliness. But instead, he had a briefcase, papers spread across my coffee table, and a calmness that felt sharp. He explained the math, the practicality of separating our finances, the inevitability of my poverty, as if I needed a lesson in basic arithmetic. I could feel his calculations weighing me like a burden, every number a judgment against my life. I remember the sting of being called a loser, the quiet disbelief that my own son could see me as a problem to be contained. And yet, I signed every paper, keeping my composure. I wanted to stay calm. I needed to stay calm. There was something brewing beneath the surface, something he couldn't see. I didn't know what it was yet, but I could feel that life, even in its darkest moments, was preparing a turn I couldn't ignore. As I sat in my apartment that evening, folding the papers, making myself tea, I reflected on all the years I had given without complaint, all the small acts of care that had gone unnoticed. I thought about the irony of how people measure worth, how David's respect had been conditional on my financial status. I wondered if anyone else had ever felt so invisible to those they loved most. And then, in the quiet of my kitchen, I remembered the envelope waiting from Switzerland. I hadn't opened it yet, but somehow, I knew that whatever it contained would change the game entirely. For now, all I could do was breathe, wait, and consider how life has a way of preparing us for the moments when everything can change in an instant. Have you ever felt that quiet anger, that mix of hurt and resolve, when someone you love underestimates you completely? I did that night, and I didn't know that by morning. My life was about to take a turn that David could never have predicted. The morning after David left, I finally opened the envelope from Switzerland. I remember the way my hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the paper. It was from a law firm, written in formal, precise English, confirming that my great-aunt Beatrice, someone I had met only once decades ago, had left me her entire estate. The number made me sit down hard, 900 million. At first, I couldn't breathe. It seemed unreal, like a story I had read somewhere, not my own life. I stared at the letter repeatedly, trying to convince myself that it was a mistake, a clerical error. But the more I read, the more I understood that it was real Swiss banks, properties in Geneva, London, New York, Monaco, and a private collection of art worth more than I had ever imagined. I felt a strange calm wash over me. There was no celebration yet, no giddy joy, just a quiet certainty that my life had just shifted in ways David could never anticipate. I began thinking strategically, methodically. If he believed I was powerless, I could use that perception to my advantage. I needed a plan, and I knew exactly who to call. Jonathan Walsh, my late husband's estate lawyer, was the perfect person to help me navigate this. Over the next few hours, I outlined what I wanted: the ability to discreetly acquire assets, maintain anonymity where necessary, and eventually ensure that David and Patricia, the people who had tried to protect themselves from my poverty, would feel the consequences of underestimating me. Every decision had to be precise. I couldn't act out of anger. It had to be calculated, fair, and ultimately instructive. I wanted them to understand the lesson without losing sight of my own integrity. I imagined myself moving pieces on a chessboard, each step designed to transform my life and, at the same time, illuminate truths they had refused to see. As I closed the letter and placed it back in the drawer, I felt a sense of resolve unlike anything I had experienced in years. Life had handed me an unexpected opportunity, and I was ready to use it wisely. The question lingered in my mind: how would David and Patricia react when they finally realized I was no longer powerless? I didn't know yet, but I was about to find out. Once I had the confirmation that the inheritance was real, I knew I had to act carefully. I began with research, as I always had when facing a challenge. I wanted to understand everything about David's insurance company, Morrison Financial Services, and Patricia's interior design business. Every detail that could help me make decisions with precision. It wasn't about revenge. It was about teaching a lesson and reclaiming my power. I set up meetings with Jonathan Walsh, explaining the goals quietly and clearly. He listened carefully as I outlined the acquisitions I intended: David's company, Patricia's office building, and eventually, the bank that held their mortgage. Each move was deliberate, designed to protect my interests while subtly letting them feel the consequences of underestimating me. The thrill wasn't in punishment, it was in observation, in seeing how people respond when they realize they misjudged someone they thought powerless. I remember feeling a strange calm as I made offers through shell companies, my mind ticking through every possible outcome. It was fascinating to watch how the world reacts when someone who seemed weak gains unseen strength. David, for all his business acumen, had no idea that the woman he had called a loser was now maneuvering behind the scenes in ways he could never anticipate. Patricia, too, was about to learn a difficult lesson. Her office building, her carefully cultivated business, all became part of my plan. I thought about how she had meticulously calculated my supposed poverty, trying to safeguard herself and her husband. I smiled quietly, imagining the moment she would realize that her calculations were now irrelevant. By the end of the week, offers were made and accepted. David's company was under my control. Patricia's building belonged to me. I watched, sometimes from a distance, sometimes directly, as they started to feel the shift. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't vindictive. I was patient and precise. I wanted them to understand, truly understand, the consequences of their choices without needing to shout or threaten. And yet, I couldn't help but feel a satisfaction deep in my chest. There was justice and balance in seeing respect restored where it had been absent. I reflected on all the years I had been patient, quiet, underestimated. Finally, the world was bending to a truth I had known all along. Underestimating someone based on appearances, age, or circumstances is always a mistake. But even as I executed each step, I reminded myself that this was only the beginning. The real test would be their realization, the moment they understood that the woman they had dismissed was now in control of their lives in ways they hadn't imagined. I prepared for that moment, savoring the calm before the storm, knowing it would be inevitable. Have you ever been underestimated in a way that stung quietly, that left you determined to prove your worth in subtle, unstoppable ways? That was exactly what I felt as each piece of the plan fell into place, and I knew the coming days would be revealing in ways no one could ignore. The day I stepped into Morrison Financial Services, I felt a mixture of calm and anticipation. David was already there, unaware of what the morning held. I imagined the flicker of confusion and disbelief that would cross his face when he realized I was now in a position of authority he hadn't anticipated. For years, he had calculated my supposed failures. Now, he would experience the shift of power firsthand. Meeting the management team, I presented myself with confidence, explaining that I was the representative of the new ownership. David's eyes widened as the reality sank in. The very company he had built his identity around was now under my direction. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the quick breath he tried to disguise. It wasn't about intimidation. It was about showing that the life he assumed I had was only part of the story. Patricia, too, would soon feel the consequences. Her office building, once a source of pride and stability, was now under my control. I thought about the calculated measures she and David had taken to shield themselves from my so-called poverty, and I felt a quiet sense of poetic justice. It was not malicious, just balanced and inevitable. I guided the team through operational updates, decisions, and future planning, making it clear that no immediate disruptions were intended for staff or clients. But the subtle power shift was unmistakable to those paying attention. David could no longer treat me as invisible or inconsequential. Patricia could no longer assume I was powerless. The realization would come in layers, and I let the silence linger just long enough for it to resonate. I watched David wrestle with the sudden reversal. His voice, normally so measured, faltered as he tried to reconcile his assumptions with the truth, and I allowed myself a quiet reflection. This was not revenge in the typical sense. It was education, a demonstration of consequences, a mirror reflecting their past judgments back at them. From my perspective, it was fascinating and sobering. Years of underestimation and dismissiveness had brought them to this moment, and I observed how fragile their sense of control truly was. I understood that the lesson would not be fully realized immediately, but every glance, every pause, every falter in their composure marked the beginning of awareness. As I left the office that day, I felt the weight of history and family dynamics shifting, a new balance settling into place. The challenge was not just in acquiring assets or asserting authority, it was in ensuring that respect and understanding were finally recognized. I wondered quietly if they would ever see the depth of patience and resilience that had brought me here. And with that thought, I prepared for the next phase, knowing that the consequences they were about to face in their personal and professional lives would continue to unfold in the days ahead. Sitting in my office that evening, I let myself breathe and reflect on everything that had happened over the past few weeks. The quiet moments, the small victories, the careful planning, they all led to a revelation I hadn't expected. It wasn't just about money or control. It was about understanding, respect, and the way people treat one another when they think no one is watching. I thought about David and Patricia, about the way they had measured my worth in numbers, in assumptions about my poverty. I realized that their calculations were never just practical. They reflected a mindset I wanted to challenge. And now, through careful, deliberate steps, I had created an environment where they could see, truly see, the impact of their choices. This journey had taught me something else. True strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it grows quietly, behind the scenes, until it becomes undeniable. My patience, my restraint, my ability to observe and plan, these were as valuable as any inheritance. I had learned that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned through integrity, wisdom, and the courage to act when the moment arises. As I reflected, I also thought about the people in my life who had remained kind, loyal, and generous without expectation. They reminded me that power should be wielded with care, that teaching a lesson doesn't require cruelty. The satisfaction I felt wasn't in seeing discomfort or fear. It was in knowing that justice and awareness could be achieved through thoughtful action. I found myself wondering if they would ever truly understand the lesson. Perhaps not fully, perhaps only in fragments. But even fragments are enough to spark change, to encourage reflection, and I hoped that by observing consequences firsthand, they would begin to reassess how they measure the worth of those around them. As the evening deepened into night, I poured myself a cup of tea and watched the city lights through my window. The quiet satisfaction I felt wasn't about revenge, it was about balance, perspective, and a deep understanding of human nature. And in that quiet, I allowed myself a rare, gentle smile, knowing that life had delivered a lesson to those who had once thought they were untouchable. Looking back on everything, I feel a quiet sense of completion. The journey from being dismissed and underestimated to reclaiming my life and asserting my worth has been both humbling and empowering. I've realized that respect and love cannot be measured by money, convenience, or appearances. They are earned through choices, integrity, and how we treat each other when no one is watching. David and Patricia learned lessons I hoped they would carry with them, about responsibility, empathy, and the consequences of underestimating those they think are powerless. Watching them confront the outcomes of their actions was not about revenge, it was about education, about showing what it feels like to have your future quietly controlled by someone you dismissed. At the same time, I found joy in knowing that the innocent, my grandchildren, the community, and those who treat others with kindness are protected and valued. Wealth and power, when guided by thoughtfulness, can create opportunity without causing harm. I've come to see that patience, observation, and thoughtful action are the most powerful tools we have to influence the lives of those around us positively. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this: never underestimate the quiet, resilient, overlooked people in your life. Respect and empathy matter more than numbers. And sometimes, life gives you the chance to see who truly values you for who you are, not what you have. If my story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experiences in the comments. Like this video if it inspired you, and subscribe to hear more stories about life, family, and the lessons we learn when we least expect them. Because every story has meaning, and your voice matters.